go. All right, well, again, welcome. My name is Kevin MacRitchie, and I am excited to share information with you about NetHope and the work that you're doing in the humanitarian and NGO sector. We are at University of Waterloo with phenomenal graduate students here, and I'd like to share kind of what's going on and help set you the stage for the work that you're going to be doing with us. A couple key points to consider when we think about what's going on in the humanitarian sector. We want to leverage technology to be a non-disruptive tool that will allow our NGO community to provide the services that they do to their end beneficiary. If they're refugees, if they are providing water solutions, food solutions, you name it, we don't want technology to get in the way. We don't want their phones not to work. We don't want their access not to work. It needs to be that invisible layer that is always working for them and enabling them to do things more efficiently, more productive, more effectively. Even if you go out and donate to an organization, unfortunately, one of the questions that gets asked most often is how much of that money gets to the end beneficiary, right? It's a viable question. It's not always the best question, because at the end of the day, it's how you use the various tools that you have and deliver the services that are available. And some of those services cost, but you can get to a broader spectrum of people than by investing in the right kinds of tools and having the right kinds of technology available to accomplish that. So who is NetHope? What do we do? How do things happen? NetHope is comprised of two major sections and then two other sections that are around programs and so forth, and I'll define those for you here. So the supporters of NetHope are our partners. We don't call them vendors, we call them partners. They are huge donors, they are huge participants in the work they do. Many of them tend to be technology companies like Cisco and Microsoft, HP and Intel, and many, many more. We have phenomenal partners with Esri and CDW. If we think about organizations like ADP, that's your development partners who provide services for us as well, much like the work you're doing here, a lot of thought process and mindset about where we will take the work that we do and how that will benefit organizations and the cost value of the return on investment for that work. Those are our major supporters. I'll come back to the program areas in just a moment. Right now, NetHope has 43 participating members, and NetHope tends to target the largest NGOs around the globe. So organizations like World Vision and Catholic Relief Services and those kinds of organizations. We have a sister organization called Inside NGO that has approximately 300 members, and they tend to be a much smaller size organizations but do much of the same work. On the connectivity and infrastructure side within NetHope, we have a very strong partnership with Inside NGO, and most of the work that we do, we partner with Inside NGO and other of these supporter organizations to provide solutions so we can enhance and provide the best, lowest cost services in those areas. Our beneficiaries exist all around the globe in 180 plus countries. They might be receiving food programs, water programs, agricultural information, or programs to help them, education programs, basic connectivity to the world, whether it's mobile access, internet access, or both. And that may come, those funders may come from various governments, various organizations, various private donors, you name it, based on the circumstances. Within NetHope, we have 5 major program areas. You are all participating in the work that we do around connectivity primarily. Within connectivity, there's a number of areas that we focus on, such as rural broadband expansion in areas where there is no networks, for example, or reducing the cost of networks that are so exorbitantly high that people are living on $1 or $2 a day, can't pay $12 a month for network access because that's 10 times the cost of food. So that doesn't warrant their ability or financial ability to get services. So we find ways and identify ways to bring those down. Emergency response. We tend to work very closely with the United Nations and United Nations High Command for Refugees, which one of the areas of connectivity we focus heavily on is refugees as well, and that's a major portion of the project work that you're all a part of. But our emergency response teams most recently have just returned from Nepal. In fact, we still have part of our teams there. Some of our connectivity and infrastructure team were deployed there as well. Similarly with Vanuatu, with the hurricane that occurred there, all the way back to Haiti and Katrina and you name it, we tend to respond all over. And the focus there is to help the NGOs be more efficient and organize themselves and provide connectivity solutions so they have access to the world for deployment of services, food, shelter, you name it, for those that are in need. Field capacity building, if you think of that as training and education, so we don't want to go into an area and then depart, drop a bunch of equipment there, and then nobody knows how to use it when everybody runs away, and so it becomes reliant on expats or expatriates to do the work. We want to grow the expertise within the local economy and have them be self-sustaining and increase their ability to earn an income as a result. Innovation for development, or ICT for D, that's how do we use technology application-wise, so to better someone or a group or organizations in the way they use that. So for example, one of the most recent programs that just concluded for us is the prevention of sex trade in some of the Middle Eastern bloc countries, and the anti-trafficking of women work that was done there. Some applications were built around leveraging the network, for example, to do work in that area. Or how do you supply chain management for food, for example, how do you make that more efficient, leveraging the network? So there's a lot of work that gets done in that area, and I'll show you a couple examples. And then shared services. Connectivity infrastructure team does a lot of work in here, but you can think of shared services as how do we get the NGOs to cooperate and work more closely together. So we help them build a shared help desk service so they don't all have 43 separate help desk operations anymore, that they can go to a common help desk operation. They all pitch in the way it operates and support it, fund it, et cetera. A lot of the work that we do in connectivity is around how do we get them to create volume purchasing, to be able to bring their costs down, share connectivity where they can, which is an interesting concept because it's kind of like asking Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler to go in and share network infrastructure, because while they're all working over here for the end beneficiaries, human or animal in many cases, right, they are competing for the same donor dollars to get there and do that work. They're not independently wealthy, they don't have a source of income that doesn't come from donors, but because they're in this space, they know they need to be as efficient as they can, so they do work together in a lot of areas so that they can bring those and drive costs down and drive them down. So when I talk about different program areas in that ICT for D space, if you think along these lines, healthcare, education, the work that's done in monitoring and evaluation of network infrastructure, but also monitoring and evaluation maybe of natural resource management, those kinds of things, all the way around here, finance, microfinance, a lot of work done in microfinance over the years as well. Digital payments is another very big and interesting area today where most people have some sort of cell phone connectivity and to be able to use your phone. Think of it like Apple Pay, for example, in developing worlds where they don't carry cash and don't want to carry cash. And that's the way they get paid, and that's the way they pay others. So a lot of work in that area, which means very tight integration with the financial institutions in those countries as well. So a lot of work across these areas, and that's where you'll see the bulk of the work being done. Again, a quick listing of the present 43 members within that make up NetHope today. A couple interesting facts for you to be thinking about when we think about what is the NGO community, how big are they, what do they serve. They represent about a budget of $40 billion. This is all in US dollars, by the way. They represent about $730 billion in IT spend in the emerging market space. It's kind of a misnomer here, but with the money that they acquire through governments and donations and the technology investments that they make, this is what their annual spend looks like. So when we think about how do we improve that and make that more efficient, so if you are using that measurement of how much money gets to the end beneficiary that's in need, can I distribute 10 tenths or can I distribute 100 tenths to those that are surviving the Nepal earthquake, for example? We want to be able to leverage this spend as best as possible, and that's one of the things that we're talking about here. And when we talk about refugee camps, I'll give you a really good example on just a quick way that we're working and why this model makes sense for the UN, UNHCR, and all those organizations. So you can kind of see some of the rest of the things that are happening. And I talked about sharing. When we see one NetHope member or two NetHope members pick up a particular technology area or make an investment, the rest of them move there very quickly. Word of mouth played very big in this industry, unlike in competitive commercial and enterprise markets. So you'll tend to find one organization or another that will be in the trial phase, and when that happens, you'll see the rest of them move there very quickly. Or if it fails, then the rest of them won't make that move. So a lot of pilots happen in different places, and that word spreads very quickly. The kinds of impacts that we can think about, NetHope, our members, those kinds of things doing, we've deployed several thousand VSATs just even in the last couple of years for emergency response alone, but also in areas where we just cannot get connectivity. And if you're not familiar with VSAT, that's satellite connectivity for internet, and then how we deploy that for mobile services or your laptops or cell phones for Wi-Fi, those kinds of things important. We think about training IT professionals, 700 plus. We do a program that's more of an internship-based program, put them through, get them out, ensure that they have jobs. In the last 2 years, we've been able to bring in 3 countries, Uganda being one of them, Rwanda another, and I can't think of the third one off the top of my head, but help them find positions in their local countries, get them internships with financial sector, manufacturing sector, you name it, and when they come out of those internships, it's not just the technical skills, but the personal skills as well to be able to take on a role and then take on these networks that we help get deployed. So these are just some sort of impact results to kind of help you get a picture of what's happening. All of that said, the number one thing that we drive for is the longer you are participating with NetHope, whether you're a member or you're a participating partner, vendor, you name it, we want to drive the value of your time and your dollars. Whether you're giving us dollars, you're giving us equipment, you're participating with us, or you're piloting projects, that we leverage that so the longer you participate, not only do you get a stronger return on your investment and your time, but so do the other participating members, that we share that information with them, that they get to partake in the results and either use them or not in the way that they would potentially use them in their organization, as opposed to every organization piloting separately. And I'll give you an example later from Nepal to consider inefficiencies as well. I use this chart probably in every presentation. I adapt it every possible way, but when I think about connectivity and the internet and all the things that we do and the efficiency of the way we work, if we think about helping these organizations be more efficient in the way that they conduct business, not in the way they use technology, but in the way that they conduct whatever businesses that they do. And you think about if you were doing this in your personal life, if you were trying to improve how efficient you are in what you do, if you were 1% more efficient every year than you were the year before, it would take you 72 years to double your income, right? The cost of living doubles about 3 times in that 72 years, so you would fall way behind, right? That's not really where you want to be. So if you think about moving all the way up to 5% per year, you would double your standard of living in just 14 years, right? And so if we think of it that way, we turn it about and we put it in the NGO community and say, if you think about being 5+%, and by the way, 5 years ago, you could walk in as a CIO to the CEO's office and be somewhere in this 2 to 3%. If you were really good, you might be 3.5%. If you're not coming in as a starting conversation at 5% right now, I guarantee you will not have a job by the end of the year, right? Because your competitors are. And even in the NGO space, when I did some research last year, they're all talking about how to be 8% plus more efficient, which puts them down in the 6, 7, 8 year range of doubling their productivity, whether that's more efficient use of technology, more efficiencies in distribution mechanisms, you name it. So we have to think about, in this role, how do we help technology get them closer to that 8% number, because that's where they need to be at, right? And donors are asking this question now. And since all NGOs are funded by donors, if the donors are asking that question and are making a measurement calculation based on that, then it's becoming more and more important in the NGO community as well. One of the things that we think about in that previous slide, when we think about being more efficient, is when do existing incumbent core technologies that we all know, love, and trust, right? I gave up my BlackBerry about 1.5 years ago to go to my iPhone, and I used to switch to iPhone 6 from whatever it was I had before, iPhone 14. Those new and disruptive technologies that overturn what we get so accustomed and used to, and that's one of the biggest problems in the NGO space, as well as big companies, is they get very accustomed to the technology that they're using, and they don't want to go through all that whole change out, swap out. The little startups that take them down are the ones that find these disruptive technologies, right? Nobody thought that we would put up with our phone disconnecting constantly, as it did like 6 times between the Toronto airport and here talking to people. But we find that acceptable. When telephone systems were designed, they were designed to never disconnect, right? But for the flexibility of moving around and being comfortable and going, talking to people in the back of the car or on an airplane, we'll accept that to be able to have that flexibility. What are the other technologies that allow us to focus on improving that ability to be more productive, and when do we implement that? And those are the things that we need to try and find. So when we talk about the projects that you're working on here, and we think about how do we formulate them, and how do we cast some regiment around what they might look like, this is some of the things that we've done in the way we look at requirements designs, pilots, or proof of concepts is what that POC is if you're not familiar with the term, and then the size, scope, or scale of those projects. These are some of the ways that we look at that. This, of any of the charts, might be valuable when you're looking at the work that you're doing. As I see some people taking pictures, and I see Professor Carr zooming in there. This may be helpful as we think about how those projects and how you think about yours may lay out, how you put your meetings together, when you do your one-on-one sessions. Your sponsor, I know I'm sponsoring one of the groups, and we should have 4 other sponsors out there. You should be able to talk to them freely, call them. You should have their cell phone numbers, their email numbers. My groups can call me anytime, and all of you can call me anytime. I'll make sure you have my cell phone number. I'm very good about answering it, certainly if you text me. I'm faster than that I am in email right now, just because I'm on the road for the next 3 weeks. So know that if you're trying to reach me. So let's talk about an example, which is the foundation for the work that you're doing. So you've all heard about the DAB. You've heard about refugee camps. I don't know if you've ever been to one or you have looked at pictures of what they're like. They're probably not the place you want to spend the majority of your life or any much time at all. But they are a way for you to survive, right? For whatever reason, individuals may have ended up there. We want to identify ways, using technology as a part of the work that we do at NetHope, the Connectivity and Infrastructure team. What we're asking you to participate in is find ways to help people grow while they're in these camps. First off, we need to help the NGOs in the humanitarian sector, the United Nations, UNHCR, which is United Nations High Command for Refugees, if you're not familiar with that term. They head up all refugee camps around the globe, maybe minus a very small percentage, but for all practicality, they are responsible for all the refugee camps around the globe. Technology can play a huge factor in helping them be efficient in just the delivery of services, food, water, tent, shelter, let's put it that way. And then what else can we provide for them? Well, at the DOT, there's 500, almost 600,000 refugees in that facility right now. Bigger than most cities on the globe, right? It is its own town. So you have to start thinking about education and healthcare and sanitation and all those things that go along with that. And the camp is only going to grow if we don't figure out how to provide those kinds of services, right? There was a program called Cisco Knowledge Centers that we recoined to take the term Cisco out to community knowledge centers. We built many of those throughout Africa, and that became the foundation for the work that we did in Dadaab, in the refugee camp there. So if you haven't seen pictures of Dadaab, welcome to Dadaab. Those of you that will be talking to Joe Simmons, he's been there 2 or 3 times. He actually helped build and install a couple of the towers that we have there, put the antennas up on them. I don't know if he considers himself an expert climber now, but he's done a fair amount of work on some of these towers that we can distribute services there. Dadaab, being the largest refugee camp in the world, was a great experiment on basically, one, being in the middle of nowhere, and I don't mean that derogatorily, but being in the middle of somewhere, but far, far away from any kind of infrastructure. Getting services out there for connectivity was complicated. So how did the 17 NGOs that were operating there and the UN, UNHCR, World Food Program, World Health Organization, and a few others get connectivity, right? Any guesses? Because it's a long desert between there and anywhere else. Yes, ma'am? Satellite, right. So what's cool about satellite, and I can say this because the only connectivity I can get at my personal home is satellite, although I did get a $10,000 offer to bring cable out to my house, and I said, here, you can have it right back, right? So, is that it is pretty much available anywhere within reason on the planet, right? The difficulty about satellite is that it is one of the higher cost options as you start adding more megabits worth of need. So when you think about 500,000 plus people, and let's just say 23, 24 organizations trying to operate there to service them, and most of the satellite connectivity was all purchased individually. So International Rescue Committee bought their satellite, went out for bid, got their own little connectivity, and then FHI 360 got their own connectivity, and then Norwegian Refugee Council got their own. Nobody bid it out together, so they all got individual pricing from different satellite providers that they either had relationships with or you name it. And satellite, because it's infrastructure based, it's high Earth orbit, has inherent things like delays. So all this scatter traffic that we're all used to being able to ignore because we have high capacity bandwidth, you can't do that on VSAT. So they would have very small amounts of bandwidth at a relatively high cost. And so the great work that Joe did and the team that we put together on this project went out to the local providers and said, we need better connectivity. And who's going to haul fiber, microwave, something all the way out, 50 kilometers or whatever it was, from the local closest point that we could get to get a more cost-effective solution out here and put that capital investment into making that happen, right? Because refugee camps do not go on prime real estate. If you're confused about that, let me share with you. They're not going to put one right outside the university because that's prime real estate, right? They're going to put one, especially in these countries, they're going to put them where the prime real estate is not. So not great connectivity, not great roads, not great a whole lot of things, because it becomes a lot of people to house and manage. I mean, you can look at that. This is one of 5 portions of the camp, but we cannot even get that whole portion in. Yes, sir?
So do you consider this as formal or informal?
What's that?
Do you consider these camps are formal or informal camps?
Formal or informal camps is the question. Certainly Dadaab is a formal camp. Even with the recent politics around it, political issues around Dadaab, it's clearly a formal camp. It's there, and it's not easy to move nearly 600,000 people overnight if you would need to do that. There are some less formal camps we can talk about in just a moment, and I'll give you some examples on that. So if you think about potentially as many as 1,000 workers trying to support these 600,000 people, and you have 17 or 18 or 22 very small connections, you're not going to get a lot done. You can't be thinking about productivity, you're thinking about the absolute basics, right? So as you're thinking about your solutions as a part of your projects, you can take this model that we then went to long-haul microwave to get us connectivity out there, which looks kind of like fiber, but has all the characteristics or issues around microwave, so we get higher capacity, but things like rate fade and other things can occur. And then did some wireless distribution within the camp so that we could walk around with laptops, phones, anything that had Wi-Fi connectivity, and ultimately could add cellular connectivity as well. We implemented voice over the internet, the local LAN there as well, so we could allow, believe it or not, the IRC guy at the desk as close as Peter and I, or Professor Carr and I are right now, could not talk to each other on the phone, right? Because they didn't have self-services, they didn't have connectivity, and they couldn't have enough bandwidth to do outside calling. So a local area network was put in place inside the NGO portion of the compound so that they could then share an IP-based telephony solution and actually call and talk to each other among the various buildings, which are as close as all your classrooms are here as we're walking through the hall. So if I needed to contact the Red Cross over in the next building, they could not do it. Now we're actually in the process right now of bringing fiber optics in there. We have an implementing partner that would like to do that, and we can bring hundreds of megabits in there. So those VSAT connections were anywhere from maybe 1 to 3 or 4, maybe at most 5 megs that were being used at the thousands of dollars per megabit. We're bringing in fiber optics now, and the demand has gone up so high, so let's just say we average 3-4 megabits times 22. That's what they were using in bandwidth. They're looking at going to 250 megabits almost immediately in this facility. The healthcare facility, which is still not connected on anything great in terms of connectivity, has a starting requirement of 30 megabits and may go as high as 50 or 70 megabits. Why? Because they want digital imaging for radiology. They want remote surgical capability, all those kinds of things. This is a big city. This is a big place. And so when we think about the bigger the facility is and the more permanent that it may be, we have to take into account those kinds of services that become required as well, and the reporting information. One of the things that we offered on here was digital-based security around the perimeter. If you're familiar with the conflict that has gone on around the area, unfortunately, there were a few Doctors Without Borders that were murdered on their way out to the facility or just inside the compound a couple of years back. And so we've been looking at using the internet and the connectivity with video-based solutions for perimeter management, those kinds of things. They're using video-based security solutions internally just by the way of the phones that are in place, because they have screens and they can look at people and see people. And so they no longer require somebody to come from way out here to come and verify that the person coming to the gate is who they are. They can get to a phone and they say, yep, that's the person, and they let them in the gate now. So there's all kinds of extra things that come when you start thinking about these solutions as well. And so as you're thinking about them in your projects that you're working on, know that if you come up with a great idea, digital payments is another one. USAID, I believe, told us that we could save them several $1 million a year, not just USAID themselves, but the whole way in which individuals get paid in the camp and then turn around and buy services, whether it's food, water, you name it. We could save them millions of dollars a year in just making that more efficient through electronics. Give them a little key fob, give them a card swipe, put it on their phones, for those that have phones, you name it. And so the cost to do that with the infrastructure in place was far less than, it was a 1 or 2 year payback to make that happen. So those are the kind of add-on things that when donors start saying, well, what's the return? What are you going to do with it? We talk about that productivity, right? If you're saving millions of dollars a year by just implementing that, you can put that money towards different things, maybe better education, so people can educate themselves out of the facility, which we have already done, and there are several people that are doing that. So that's sort of a fixed facility, very formal kind of facility. One of the groups is working on more of the term displaced persons. Now these might be a less formal camp, whatever that case might be. They may also be, in some cases, where individuals, and this is the hardest one to try and figure out, they may be picked up and moved to the student housing. 4 or 5 families might move to the student housing over here, and the UN would pick up that cost. And then somebody else might get displaced to France into an apartment complex, and somebody else might get displaced somewhere else. And so they would be funded by the UN or the UNHCR for a period of time, wherever it is they might end up. And the complexity around that, one is tracking where they are, remaining connected with them, and then helping them find family, education services, healthcare, all the things that we've talked about already, to then integrate back into society, either permanently where they got displaced to, or ultimately find family where they want to get to, because they're probably not going back to where they came from, unfortunately. Most would like to. And so the other thing to consider when we think about these things is think about all those people that in the camp that you saw, right? They want to find family, right? And so social networks have gotten huge. Now that the individuals in the camp are getting access as well, because the infrastructure is getting bigger, we're making it more resilient, more redundant. We can start adding these services that if the network was down, nobody would get food, so we need to add things like diesel generators and all those things for the network so that doesn't happen, right? When they go to the education facilities, they're looking for family somewhere in the world, trying to find them, right? So search engines and all the tools you probably know way more about than I do in terms of social networks, they're all over that. And many of them, I'm very proud to say, when we got Norwegian Refugee Council to take that CKC concept, that Community Knowledge Center concept, there are now 5 full-fledged classrooms in there, and there are people going through those classrooms with the connectivity solutions that we provided and the educational content from Norwegian Refugee Council, and they are educating themselves out and moving to Europe, moving to Canada, moving to the United States with jobs in place before they go, right? And so it's the first time ever we've been able to show to the UN that you can create hope for people that, for all practical purposes, have no hope. So to motivate them in a compound like that, and I hate to use that term, is very difficult when there is no hope for where am I going to go next. But when they have those educational opportunities and can go find family or decide that they want to go somewhere, some of them have left and gone on to university and finished their schools, taken their kids with them. And we think that's great, and that has provided a whole set of interest where in the project that you're doing, we'll talk in depth here in just a moment on that, the UN is very interested in how this research will play out so they can reformulate what they do everywhere else. And remind me to tell you about the funding for that connectivity. We'll come back to that in just a moment. This is one example of how organizations work together on funding. So this is an example of working with USAID. USAID contributed some funding. If you're not familiar with USAID, it's the U.S. Agency for International Development. They focus on rural development for networking and connectivity solutions. They partnered with us in Dadaab. Cisco and Microsoft were the two largest funders for the initial Dadaab project and have been. USAID has played a phenomenal monitoring and evaluation role and very supportive of driving solutions in this area. And they do a good job of keeping everybody on track and thinking about where we need to go next with us in solutions. And then we continue to ask. They play a very specific role, especially in these areas. Shared solutions, mobile innovations, I talk about digital payment systems. Those are a lot of the things that they really focus on and help us think about when we look at these multi-year commitments. And you'll see here, this chart is not meant for you to have to memorize numbers. I had a history teacher in college. My favorite history teacher was my Russian history teacher in high school. Right? He wanted that we knew the concepts. You know, if I knew within a 5 or 10 year window that this war occurred and this result in whatever, everybody got an A+, right? I went to college, took the same course, and if you didn't know it was 1814, 1815, or 1816, you failed. And so that's not the point here, and I know Professor Carr does not teach that way either. This is a way that we look at targeting geographic areas, and this is just one of a number of things, and the kinds of services that we might be driving there. So this particular one, we were looking at what countries and funding for countries that were happening to determine where we were going to focus on emergency response, for example, solutions and why. So what countries are most prone to natural disasters, which ones have the least resilient infrastructures, those kinds of things, and what funding do they get from where. So here's the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, Guatemala, et cetera. And then what areas, based on the donor focus areas, are they interested in? Education, social services, health, environmental solutions, those kinds of things, so we can pull that together and figure out how to get a project. You may have to do some of this when we start thinking about, especially the financial team, about where are we going to derive funds and who's interested in funding this kind of work, right? And so you may pull together some of this and you'll have these charts if you're interested in taking a look at that. So where do we go from here? What are your projects trying to accomplish? Well, while Dadaab is the largest refugee camp in the world, they're not the only one, right? The next largest, or one of the next largest facilities is a place called Kakuma. Very hard to get funding for Kakuma. Happens to also be in Kenya. Peter Haig, who's on the phone, I think you're still there, right, Peter? Maybe he's on mute.
Yeah, still here.
Perfect.
Still here.
So Peter Haig and I were talking about the fact that for the teams working on the more formal refugee camp and the financial models, we should take Kakuma and use that as your model. So as opposed to trying to create something fictitiously, you have a place to consider. I think there's 100 to 250,000. I cannot remember off the top of my head, but it's still a pretty large facility. It's still like Dadaab. It's far, far away from a lot of resources, so we'll have to take that into account. We might have to think about, again, stepping up into larger VSAT kinds of services until we can find fiber installers. I have an organization that we can work with that can really help us with local technology partners there, so that those teams that are working on either financial models or the more traditional refugee camp model, I'll make sure that we get you in touch with those to help you with pricing and connectivity kind of options. Matt Altman is our best technical guy that we have, and he's available as well to anybody, but I think he's leading the technical architectures team, if I'm not mistaken. I should remember, I signed them all out, so get a lot of questions back. What am I doing? Most of them will aware of that. So, interesting part when you think about funding. So why does the UN care about this, right? They've come back and said, we are extremely interested in doing this. In fact, we worked on this about 1.5 years ago, and the UN and UNHCR were so interested, they said, go make this happen, and we will fund and fundamentally change the way we operate. And so we drove down that path, and Gisli, who's the head of our emergency response team, was a very active participant with us as well. He's got a lot of great contacts inside the UN, because when Gisli deploys, everybody at the UN listens when there's an emergency going on, right? And Gisli goes everywhere, anytime. We ship him out of Iceland to all over the globe when there's a problem. The interesting part is we started down this path, and then we had one natural disaster after another, right up to the most recent Nepal one. So over the last year plus, the UN has been extremely busy with disasters. We have been extremely busy with disasters and getting all the other connectivity things fit in place. But here's what happens, right? In a facility like the Dadaab, the vast majority of the funding comes through the UN or UNHCR, right? And so they'll say, we need somebody to deal with food distribution systems. And so a bunch of the NGOs that were on that list will bid for that opportunity, right? And so they'll win the bid, and they're there, and they're getting their money now from UNHCR, and they gotta go out and put everything together, right? So one of the first things they do is they go bid for connectivity, right? I'll stand still, Peter, sorry. And then IRC will win something else, and then they'll go bid for connectivity, right? And then they'll create all their distribution systems. So for every winning bid, that organization basically figures everything out from scratch, right? And the UNHCR / UN is funding it to them to turn around and buy it at the highest possible dollar. Even though they might bid for the lowest price, it's still, at the end of the day, the highest possible dollar. It's costing them the most amount of money. Versus, if we went out and said, which is what we're in the process of doing for the second go-around in the Dadaab right now, as we put this fiber in place, we want to buy 250 megabits, and we want it in the ground, and I want to be able to go to 10 gigabits in the next 2 years, and they say, so what, we change the electronics on each end, big deal. We've got all the fiber pairs you need, and we can do that across one set of fiber pairs, and you can split it out any way you want inside the facility, or we can lay the fiber directly to each NGO's compound and then put it up, drop fiber into your wireless antennas to provide services to all those refugees, right? Where is the buying power bigger? Is it bigger if I'm buying 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 megabits at a time? Or when I'm standing there saying I want 250 megabits to start and I want 10 gigabits capacity built into it, right? Buying it for 10, 20% of the cost. And so the UN says, well, wait a minute, if you can do that, and it's really our money that we distribute out 23 ways, that turns around and gets spent 23 ways on the highest dollar. If they bought it here and said, we just provided you a 250 megabit capacity, and now it's a 500 megabit, now it's a multi-gigabit capacity, and we bought that whole gigabit for less than you were buying 100 megabits for, that's huge, because now they can enable healthcare, they can enable education a whole lot differently, right? They want to do that across the board. Food distribution systems. Instead of one organization using system A, one using system B for water, another one using for sanitation removal, whatever, they want to have that supply chain management system manage all that so they can buy it here. Again, maybe they can buy it for 10, 20, even if it's half the cost of what 8 other organizations are doing it for. And it's not that the NGOs are inefficient, because believe me, they are models of efficiency, because they don't get a lot of money and they have to do things on a very, very thin amount of finances. But if we can make that differentiation, there are better and more services that we can offer. So that's what we're trying to be able to drive. So you have to think about that when we take the work that you're doing, we're not going back to the NGOs and having the conversation. They're all sort of, well, yeah, that makes sense, right? And they all say that makes sense. They're helping us take it to the UN, not just even UNHCR. We're going up straight to the UN. Right? We were slated to speak not too long ago with them about this. We have had several conversations with them about this. They're talking about taking some of the work that you will do and implement right away. Some of it, especially on the displaced people effort, will be, my guess is you will yield more information than we have today, so that we could do what others, maybe on the formal refugee camp model, the next step would be to do what they're doing, right? So informational and guidance and direction. And then Accenture Development Partners, ADP, is very interested in taking some of the work that you might be doing and putting that and formalizing that in a way that the UN would accept. So some of your work may go directly with us to the UN, some of it may go by way of ADP, and some of it may go into the next 1 or 2 phases until it gets to those levels. And you're talking about impacting these people's lives, right? And the team that's doing the displaced work and or the rural access work, we will also use with USAID and other governmental funders around the globe and private foundations to fund rural expansion of broadband connectivity where there is none, right? Like my house would be great. So those are the kind of work that we're doing. In fact, next week I'll be on a project with Joe Simmons and Matt Altman. We're all 3 trucking out and going internationally to implement a TV whitespace project for a community that has no connectivity at all. So they're going to get their school and homes and so forth will all of a sudden have connectivity made available to them for the first time ever.
I mean, if the DAB was a good, or let's say successful, in terms of connectivity,
Yeah.
so why don't we like copy paste, change it a bit, and that's it? Why we are, and you, for example, investing in it again, letting us do this job while you have a successful story that you can use somewhere else?
Great question. So the question is, if the DOT was successful, why don't we cut and paste and replicate the story?
You know, with just changes regarding
Sure.
to geographical, ethnicity, or demographics
Sure.
in certain areas.
And so much of the work may cut and paste part of that. The story has been hugely successful. UN loves it, UNHCR loves it, USAID loves it, all our members love it, but change happens very slowly. And so that would be considered the pilot in their mindsets, and they'll say, well, give me the financial return on investment model now. Show me how those numbers play out on a larger scale. So if that's a little over 500,000 people, how does it play out for the 25 million refugees or displaced people? How do we make that work across multiple facilities? And how do we change our processes up here at UN or UNHCR level, which means how do we distribute money differently to the NGOs? How do we become the negotiator for bandwidth? We're one small cog in the whole. We might be the enabler, although those of you that work with Joe Simmons will tell you connectivity is the enabler, but only if we have power. And so we have to figure out all those pieces that go along the way to make that possible. So that's part one. Part two, if we go to the next country, some countries are welcoming for refugees, some of them have them, they don't want them there at all, and they're constantly trying to figure out how to get rid of them. And so they make the regulatory side of connectivity very difficult, or not. Some of them, the way they license spectrum, we might not even be able to put wireless up in a facility like that because their own citizens don't have it. So that brings up a whole nother point. Why was Dadaab also successful? Because we put one of those education facilities outside the camp in what we call Dadaab town. So Dadaab was a very little tiny village of, I don't know, a couple thousand people at most, maybe less than that when the facility started there. It's tens of thousands, if not more, in the town, not the refugee camp, but the town that built up outside of it to be able to support the refugee camp. Just think about all the things that have to flow to get to the refugee camp. They flow through the town. And where do the humanitarian workers go? They go into the town to go get dinner if they're not in the dinner line, or whatever it is that happens there, right? So there is a full-fledged functioning town, and we put one of those knowledge centers there as well. What many of the governments are requiring where there is a refugee facility is that whatever you're doing there, you must also do for the citizens in surrounding communities. Because we're not, and this is their words, not mine, they are not going to have the refugees have more services than their own citizens. So you take that and you start thinking about what do we have to be able to ultimately provide into the town. So what's our incentive in many cases to get Safaricom, Orange, and Liquid, which are the local providers that we bring microwave in from, and now Liquid we're bringing fiber in from. Incentive is, one, they know they have a multi-year recurring revenue from the NGOs that are there, no matter which way we get the dollars to flow. But the bigger money for them is they get to go take care of all those commercial businesses. They're going to run fiber all the way out to the town first, because that's where their point of presence is going to be. Then they're going to shoot it into the refugee camp. They're going to get every business there because they have money. They survive off of the people that are getting paid to run the refugee camp. And as a result, their citizens' income levels are going up because services are needed in and out of there. Even if it's just hauling trash out, that job didn't exist for that local citizen before that camp was there, right? So they probably can make 3 to 10 times more money doing that than they were doing whatever it is they were doing before. And so we have to figure out, as a part of those fixed facilities, and potentially those variable displaced ones, which are, there's another complex problem, how do we then enable an economic development to occur so we're not funding it necessarily, but those services generate revenue for those service providers that they are willing to go there and give us the kind of rates that we want to get inside those compounds. It's a little bit of a complex problem, and it's a selling issue when we go talk to those service providers about how do I get them interested in the commercial part of the business at a, quite honestly, even though it's a low income typically environment, but they can make more profit margin there than we want them to make over in the refugee camps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because like that's one of the things that we were thinking of. So like if you're looking at certain refugee camps, especially like if you talk about Lebanon or Jordan or even Turkey, in those areas where these refugee camps are, there is basically people who, like we met, who we work with, who has mobiles,
Yep.
and they have internet. Yes, it is expensive, so they can still use it, but it's not for the mass population who are there.
Right.
But if we looked at a broader concept of looking at other refugee camps, which is, let's say, in Africa or even in Far East Asia, the way we think as a group, how the connectivity will help them, it's going to be totally different. So that's one of the very basic questions we ask, is that if you can give us a geographical location where we can concentrate, because otherwise we'll be like doing huge or broad,
Well, Peter Hagen and I were talking about today. So if we were making a recommendation for you, we would say, use Kakuma.
Okay.
And we know that the ambassador to the U.S. from Kenya and the Kenyan ambassador from reverse of that, they are both very interested in making that happen. And when we had the discussion with the UN, they were driving us, pushing us down that path. It stalled for 2 reasons. One, a whole series of natural disasters, and everybody got diverted. But everybody kept saying, on both or all the many sides of the equation, we need to get back to this. And so here we are with you. While we're out working on Nepal and Vanuatu and you name it, we still need to make these things happen in the background, because we don't want to be single-faceted. We want to be able to drive these programs multifaceted. So here you are as a phenomenal research team to help make that happen. And we will give you all that credit for making that happen. But that would be the place to start. We'll use Kakuma as that starting model, and then the teams that have a bit more obscure areas will get you a model for that as well. And we'll pull one straight out of the UN UNHCR handbook. Yes, ma'am.
Peter also mentioned some kind of comparative analysis between that and a camp in Thailand. Do you know the name of the camp?
Peter, which camp in Thailand are you talking about? Thailand's one of my favorite places, by the way.
Oh, yeah. I don't know the name of it, but it was something that came up in conversation with UNHCR.
Okay, I'll find it and I'll get it out to you. The thing, back to your question, is we can start thinking about these models, and we can start thinking about providers that want to participate in this space and get it. So Safaricom, Orange, and Liquid get the model, right? And so countries where they operate in, it's a quicker conversation to start with them, right? Thailand will be a brand new conversation, a completely different culture than Kenya, and getting them interested in how that all works and building that model will take time. But if we can show them how it's worked elsewhere and how it's generated profit margin on the commercial side of the business in the outlying towns, and that we're able to deliver additional services into those outlying towns or border towns similarly or better, and maybe the border towns get the A-level service and the refugee camp gets the B-level service, if that's what they require, because we have to meet those governmental regulations, we can do that pretty easily. But we want to do that in a way that we're not funding it, that they're getting the telcos realize that with their base funding out of the refugee camp, they can make that business case work in those outlying counties. And we might have to have a pilot project in 1 or 2 so that we can get them started, but other questions? I don't think we got any more major slides.
So Kevin's open for any questions.
Yeah, questions, or do you want to break into teamwork, or whatever you have next, so, yes, sir?
So the connectivity option in the DAP, right? The NetHope or partners who set up would have to go through any certification process with the local carrier?
Did the local partners have to go through certification courses
For
with
your
the?
equipment, for your antennas and whatnot.
Well, not so much certification courses, but we needed the providers it needed to be equipment that A, was licensed in the country, and that those providers offered as a service in some way, right? So originally it was VSAT services, so there was no local element to it, right? And here's the interesting thing about VSAT services. Well loved by the NGOs, extremely flexible, again, higher cost. Not necessarily well liked by local government or local ISPs. Why? Because it circumvents the ISPs from making money, it circumvents local jobs, and it circumvents taxation, for the most part. Not
They
always,
cannot control.
right? And I don't want my very dear friends in the satellite world and VSAT community to be upset with me for saying that, especially since it's being recorded. But it can be far more easily regulated, whether it's good or bad, that you can define based on country by country, if it's a local provider, right? And so many of the programs will also say we need a local provider where possible because they want to grow their local economy to be able to support these things. So in those cases, we're looking for the Safari Coms, the Oranges, and now the Liquids, such as in the DA, so we can show money's coming in there are going to support the local economy. And guess what? Regulators tend to be much better with questions about can we do this or can we do that? Here's how we can make that happen. Than they are if you're saying, well, we're circumventing everything that you have in place. Anyway, we don't want to do that. We want to be friends there because we want to help the facility out, right? And we want to help those people out. Does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
So talking about the technical options which you guys have in Kenya, in the camp, you want us to explore some other technical options as well, apart from what you guys did in the camp?
Yes. Yes, so the question is, do we want you to explore different options than we necessarily did in the DOT? Absolutely. Again, that's sort of that disruptive technology curve. When do we think about the next thing, right? We have a lot of folks that are looking at much of the Meraki deployments to help traffic management shaping. We don't really have that in the DOT in the way that we've deployed with many of the more current, more recent VSAT solutions that we've provided to help eliminate unneeded traffic. A quick example would be we deployed 100 plus, 200 plus VSAT terminals as a part of the Ebola effort in all 3 countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, right? And many of them were small aperture or small VSAT satellite dishes, right? Generally geared for 1 to 5, 6, 8 users maybe. Some of them were bigger, designed for much bigger uses. But what happens when, think about the relief workers, right? Think about the people that went in on the Ebola effort. Think about the people that are giving up 1 to 2 years of their life to go work in Dadaab or Kakuma or anywhere else from Canada, US, anywhere around the globe that they may come to participate there because they're part of Doctors Without Borders or IRC or whoever they might be with, right? They still want to talk to their family. They still want to have recreational time. What was happening in Ebola that was driving the satellite cost so much? And we're filming right now. People were watching YouTube. People were doing this, people were doing that. So they were exceeding the maximum data limits on their VSAT range, and then they were getting shut off during the day or throttled down so far that the actual work they needed to do, they were calling and saying, can you please buy us more bandwidth because we're out of bandwidth. So we started implementing traffic shaping, traffic monitoring, and traffic killing solutions for the things that were getting traffic on the network that we didn't want on the network because we needed them focused in those particular areas for the amount of money we were spending for solutions, right?
But when we go for more sophisticated techniques of connectivity, we might get higher costs, right? So
Possible?
yeah. So there should be a balance between the two.
There should be a balance between the two, but we also want to think about when we know what those potential solutions look like, we're also going to go to those manufacturers and say, we want you to participate in this program. Right? We don't want to be paying list price. We don't want to be paying, you know, best possible discounts. We want a negotiated rate for these kinds of crisis situations. So I actually put refugee camps and displaced people. Most organizations don't, and NetHope doesn't even officially do it. But I put them in the same kind of emergency response crisis situation as Nepal earthquake or anywhere else, right? It's a humanitarian, devastating crisis for these people. They may not have famine because they're being fed. They may not have a shelter collapsing on them, but you saw the tents they're living in. If they're lucky, right? We need to help these people get back to the life. These people in the dock were all agricultural farmers. They had, you know, in their culture and their lives, they had a wonderful life, right? And it's not us to judge whether they should be making millions of dollars or $10 in a day, but they had a living and they got displaced to here. They don't want to be there any more than you and I would want to be displaced there. So finding those solutions and finding the manufacturers that will help us. We're not asking them to give us the equipment for free, and some will, and some will donate to do pilots. And please, if you're listening, please feel free to donate all you want. But we want a viable solution that works for them, and we'll go to their corporate social responsibility organizations and their sales teams and you name it to help understand the work that can be done here in this sector and how they can participate to make a difference. And then leverage that in their own marketing and advertising and that work as well. Cisco, Microsoft, HP, Intel, and many other of our great partners understand that and get that. Many times they donate without question for the big emergencies, but I think these are equal emergencies, if not bigger. They just are self-sustaining, and they go on so long that you tend to try and, I don't want to say you try to, but you tend to forget about it because there's just a process that goes on there. And so we're trying to make a way that we can help those people educate and find their way out. Give them hope, right? Yes, sir.
I believe maybe it's a question out of the context, but you've mentioned that one of the biggest problems is that there are so much small NGOs that they're working in the same area and, you know, maybe on the same land or the same camp, and it leads at the end to basically paying extra costs. So what's, in your opinion, what are the obstacles, or, you know, of why these small organizations not go to emerge and form a bigger entities that basically has a higher influence instead of, like, you know, smaller influence?
So the question is, and mostly so we can get it back on film, I don't know if you can hear that, and everybody in the room can hear it as well, is if all these NGOs are smaller, even though they might be large NGOs, they might have a small or, you know, medium to moderate size office, field office, you name it, in these camps. Why don't we get them to merge and so forth? The best way that comes in my head to describe that, think about building a house, right? You don't ask your electrician and your carpenter to merge and become one organization, right? They do separate functions, they do very distinctly separate things, and your main carpenter doesn't want to touch an electrical wire, and he doesn't want to be a plumber, right? He wants to frame in your house. He's maybe not even a finished carpenter. He wants to frame in your house, and he wants to go in and go on to the next house and frame in that house, right? So NGO 1 might be around setting up supply chain management systems. Maybe that's all they do, right, for these kinds of things. And then they want to be off, or they want to then monitor and evaluate that that's being used properly. Somebody else does housing solutions, whether it's tents or fabricated housing. Habitat for Humanity would be a good example, right? Somebody else does healthcare solutions only, right? They don't know how you get water over at your tent. They don't know how you, but they do healthcare. So if you're not feeling well or you're sick, or if they're not even to that level in that particular facility, they're there for disease prevention with that many people and sanitation issues in one spot. That's all they do, and that's all they know how to do, right? So I can't ask the NGO who knows about sanitation to work with and consolidate what they do as an organization with the one that helps people understand how to do better farming, right? And so it's always going to be segmented that way, and the jobs from UNHCR or UN or whoever bids them out, USAID, the Canadian Aid Organization, you name it, they're bidding out, part of that process is to bid out water solutions, bid out sanitation solutions, right? And that's why I say we want to get above the recipients of the bid awards. We want to get above this part. We want to get way up here. The conversations we're having are with the UN primarily, and with the UNHCR as an active participant. The process has to change way up here. So when you're thinking about your work, the construct of the implementation is down here, but the people that we are going to influence to make that change sit way up here, right? So that's where Peter, who is phenomenal at, by the way, at fundraising and driving change at that level, is looking at the research that you're doing as to how he can put that in his words to help the folks at the UN General Assembly, for example, if we get an audience there, would be great, to talk about this, right? And then that would change the way the funding model would work on this whole thing over time. And if we only change the connectivity model first, and then that drives change for supply chain management, water distribution, whatever down the road, that'll go a huge way because the rest of it'll swing. If we can show them 50 and 70 and 80% cost reductions, 30% cost reductions, and then we can show them how they leverage that to do digital payment systems, for example, then that will save money enough to do free education or down the road, and then that gets enough people getting out of the camp that they can do better health care. Each one can benefit the next one. The savings from one can fund the capital investment of the next one to create savings to fund the next one. But if we're not doing it at the UN level and UNHCR level with the research of what's happening down below, that's how we'll make that change happen. So know that that's where your work is going to go be messaged and delivered for big change.
Thank you.
Anybody? Yes, sir.
Does the refugee camp have any, can it require any level of security solutions? And then does the refugee camp currently have any device or servicing or solution for the network security?
So network security is the question. Is there devices there? We have to consider what that should look like. So when everybody had independent VSAT solutions or satellite solutions, probably not a lot of network security because you at Canadian Red Cross, the 3 of you, 4 of you right there, were the only ones that could get attached. You physically had to be there. There was no wireless, etc. So if you didn't have a key to the building, you didn't know your passcode, probably nobody else was getting on, right? Yeah. But when we think about bringing high capacity lines in and distributing them across the local area network that might be shared, because now we want to share telephony systems and so forth, yes, network security becomes a big issue, right? Just in the data and the things that we want to do there, traffic management, traffic shaping is a part of that. So we can say, you know, yeah, to YouTube after hours, but not during the day. Whatever it is that they want to implement as local policy as a part of that security element. And then making sure that the network's being used the way it's supposed to be used. And then you can implement physical security over the network as well. Video cameras, you know, border, or whatever it is you want to do from there. But yeah, it becomes very critical when we change it out from a bunch of individual connections to a shared set of connectivity across the land. Because in all honesty, Red Cross doesn't really want IRC seeing their data, right? And so you need the security that prevents that. And I'm just picking two at random, but nobody wants anybody else seeing their data unless they intentionally want to share. And then you'll have the inverse of that where, let's say those that are doing distribution of food, water, services, housing, needs to get from data from each one of those individual players to say, okay, I can go out to this piece of land right here and drop a tent, you know, water pails and whatever else goes for the next family that's coming in, and they say go to site, you know, 300,021, and that's where your stuff is at. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Right here.
You talked about partnering up with local businesses and stuff so that you can have sustainability when the refugee camps are longer in their lifespan and stuff like that. Have you had to deal with any of local corruptions or anything like that that have held you back or restricted your ability to do that?
So local corruption is a complicated statement because we don't want to accuse any government, any organization, any individual. There's always that concern, whether it was right here in your own backyard, right? Because there's millions and billions of dollars that are flowing at various times, whether it's in products, services, equipment, and that stuff could fall off a truck or you name it. And so we do have to watch that reasonably closely. But I will tell you that all gets managed very well by the UN and UNHCR in terms of their trucks and so forth getting things to the compound, and then it gets distributed from there. But think about the supply chain from where those trucks have to go. There's been a number of times that the trucks have hit IEDs, that they have been, the trucks have been raided, so there's security from the airport to the 50 kilometers or 50 miles out to the refugee camp itself. That's a different kind of physical security. So yes is the answer, and so you have to put some systems in place to watch and manage that, because you don't want stuff to show up and then it never gets out of customs, for example, is another issue, right? Just managing the time it takes to get things in and out of customs is very complicated as well. Yes, sir.
So who were the service providers for the camp in Kenya?
Who are the service providers?
Or-
Who are they in Kenya? The ones we used on Dadaab were Safaricom and Orange, and Liquid is doing the fiber install for us right now as well. Those are the three main players that we have there, on top of a myriad of satellite providers that still offer service there.
Would you encourage us to just contact them to help
Sure.
us find options?
You can contact them, and Joe would have the direct contacts to both them, and I could get you the contacts for Liquid. We'll probably run that through Hutchinson Global Communications, HGC, who we have an agreement with NetHope to now manage all the broadband access for our members that participate in the program. They have the direct relationship with Liquid, so I will put you in touch with Robert over at HGC. And he's great. I'll be with him. I'll let him know. I'll be with him the next 3 days in Chicago. Yes, sir.
Do you prefer to use equipment from partners at MacRitchie NetHope and also locally sourced equipment, so equipment made in Kenya?
Did you say used equipment?
No, locally produced equipment in Kenya. So would you prefer to use those, not planned?
So the question is, do we like locally produced equipment? So certainly if there's equipment that's viable for the solution, we want to choose that. And here's the thing I always try to tell the government agencies, the regulators, you name it, don't get hooked on a particular technology, right? And I use this example all the time, and my friends at IBM don't like it, but I don't know if any of you in this classroom are old enough to know what token ring is. Raise your hand if you know what token ring is. Good, there's one of you in the classroom. I feel very old now. But IBM swore that was going to be the solution to solve all things, right? And then they sort of reinvented ATM to an extent, or token ring into a technology called ATM, asynchronous transfer. So both of those technologies don't exist anymore. And if you think about where IBM, if you want to take a quick look at the history of IBM, largest computer and networking manufacturer in the world, became one of the smallest in the world for a very long time. They do more consulting business now than they do computer business now, because they decided that was the technology and the world should just jump on board, no matter how good or flawed it might be. And by the way, we're not going to change it either. So things like Ethernet and Wi-Fi and WiMAX and new fiber technologies and everything circumvented that and became those disruptive technologies, and IBM wasn't going to change, right? So yes, we want to use local as much as possible, but in many of the developing worlds, they're not developing high-tech solutions, but there are partners and local providers that we want to work with, and we want to know what solutions that they generally would implement. So we're not necessarily saying you need to retrain your whole staff to just use X, right? We want to know what their implementing solutions are, what their preferences are, so we can leverage a skill set without having to go train a skill set, and then train up the net difference that gets them from here to here, if that's necessary. But a lot of times they're providing solutions in on a carrier perspective, and then we're helping build out local area networks. And all, especially these bigger camps, all of those organizations, or most of them, have some IT staff or a couple IT individuals there. And then, trust me, many of the refugees actually help climb towers and wanted to improve their skills. And some of them work on the network day in and day out. And they're probably not going to leave the refugee camp because they have jobs in the refugee camp, right? Hopefully they go out and get to work for Safaricom someday somewhere else, right?
Any
Okay,
more questions?
I'm going to this side of the room for questions now, if anybody else has.
I want to allow Kevin time to meet with his group as well, and I need time to meet with the other groups around your project plans and what's happening with your sponsors. So if there are any more questions, Kevin can take them, but otherwise we might move on with that next phase. Was there one more?
Did you have one?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between in respect to technical options in the non-refugee and the refugee camps?
In the non-refugee camps?
Non-formal.
Or non-formal?
Non-formal.
I don't know. So that's a big question, and I think that the non-refugee or displaced person environment, we might be looking at really having to understand where they're getting placed to know what kind of technology that we could put in place. So for example, if 20 families were housed here in one of your student housing because they picked them out of Somalia and flew them here, and that happens, and they put them in the same building, we might put, if anybody knows what a VPN is, we might put a small network in place for them and provide a VPN tunnel into something, whatever it might be, some service the UN has. We might buy local services for them. I don't know what that looks like yet. So one of the things Joe Simmons and I were talking about is the biggest thing that team can help us do is understand what and how the UN does with those people and how far they displace them and the kind of environments they displace them into. So your team, if that's your group, may be less focused on a solution and a far greater understanding around the environment that those individuals are being displaced to, or environments, I should say, so that maybe the next class Professor Carr has can help us with technological solutions. But if we don't understand the problem, and everybody loves to do this, I mean, I'm the most guilty guy, I want a technical solution and move to the next one, right? So if I don't understand the problem, there is no point on me trying to put a technical solution together because I don't know what I'm trying to solve. Right? And so your team, if you help us figure out what we're trying to solve, we can work with the next team, Professor Carr's class or somewhere else, maybe ADP picks it up, and to figure out what that solution looks like with the UN. Right? So you might be off the hook on technology.
Okay, any more pressing questions for Kevin? I don't want to cut the conversation short, but I was getting the sense that we were coming to a point where that would make sense. Okay, so what I'll now ask you to do is to assemble in your 5 groups, and you will have plenty of things to talk about, particularly after listening to what Kevin had to say. And I'm going to come around and talk to you. I'll let Kevin talk with his group, and if some of the other groups maybe have questions for him, we might have time for that too. But on behalf of all of you, while we're still being videoed, we should record our thanks for Kevin coming.